Hello and welcome to this first part of our three-part training on working with vulnerable people. This training is designed for volunteers with Serve the City Paris. My name is Aidan Coyle. I'm a retired academic psychologist, and much of my research and writing was focused on identity and mental health. I've been a volunteer with Serve the City Paris since September 2024.
Thank you for joining us for this training video. My name is Harapa Bakiriago, and I began volunteering for Serve the City Paris at the start of 2025. My professional background is in political campaigns, and my academic background is in international relations and law. During a Sunday soup kitchen that Serve the City Paris carries out in collaboration with L'assiette Migrante, I met Aidan. While we were peeling and chopping vegetables, I asked him about his work teaching psychology students and proceeded to inundate him with questions on the emotional state of the beneficiaries that I came across through my volunteering work. In that moment, I realized that my understanding of the beneficiary experience was limited. I didn't have enough information on their journeys and the impact that that had on both their material needs, emotional needs, or their mental health. These were questions I couldn't address to the beneficiaries themselves, as the journey is oftentimes traumatic and always personal. Aidan, in turn, was asking me questions on the rights and protections available to the beneficiaries, but yet again, I found myself unable to name them. And so we decided to join forces and create a training to better understand beneficiaries' journeys, to familiarize ourselves with the beneficiaries' rights and legal protections, and to discover their needs while reflecting on our needs. That is to say, our motivations, our limitations in the framework of our volunteering work. Today's video is the first session of a three-part training. This video is session 1, which you may watch in your own time and at your own pace. While it is an informative session, it is not a comprehensive guide of the legal and administrative processes of how a beneficiary may be recognized or receive aid in France. It is instead an attempt to understand the journeys, the challenges, and the processes undergone by the three most common groups of beneficiaries we come across volunteering: unaccompanied minors, asylum seekers, and homeless people. So today we will tell you 3 stories, and through them we hope to give you a better understanding of beneficiaries and their journeys, their rights and protections internationally and in France. If you so wish, you may want to watch each story individually.
In the second and third parts of this training, we'll get to meet in person. In the second part, we'll look at the psychological and social effects of displacement, including loss and trauma. In our work as volunteers, we can hear about traumas experienced by migrant folk, refugees, and homeless folk who use the services of Serve the City, people whom we refer to as beneficiaries. In session 2, we'll consider how we might create a safe space for beneficiaries to talk about their experiences, if they wish, and also how we as volunteers can protect our own well-being. In the third and final part of the training, you'll have the chance to work in small groups to role-play interactions between volunteers and beneficiaries. Now, I know, few people love the idea of educational role-play, but in our experience, it's a safe context in which to develop or refine skills and gain confidence in what could be quite sensitive interactions. That'll all be done in small groups, with each one led by an experienced facilitator. This first session, though, is vitally important. We're going to give you quite an amount of information about the circumstances of people who come to France as refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, and about the support that France offers, including the pitfalls in that process. It's important to have at least a general awareness of this so that you can develop an informed, empathic understanding of the beneficiaries we work with, their experiences, and the challenges that they can face.
So, Adam, who are the Service Paris beneficiaries and why have we labeled them vulnerable?
Well, through our volunteering with Certain City Paris, we've met people from all walks of life, as you well know, whether in our food distribution program, in the football program, or in our language exchange. We meet people who are refugees and asylum seekers from war-torn parts of the world, including young people who've arrived in France alone. Some of these folk may be homeless or in a precarious position. We also meet people who've come to France for economic reasons, in search of a better life, but who, for whatever reason, are currently homeless or, to use the French term, sans abri, without shelter. So what do these beneficiaries have in common? Well, they share certain characteristics that would classify them as vulnerable or potentially vulnerable. Vulnerability can arise from individual characteristics, like if a person has a cognitive or physical disability. It can arise from the external social context. It can arise from a combination of both. The United Nations considers a range of groups to be potentially vulnerable, and it specifies migrants, refugees, minorities, including indigenous peoples, people living in poverty, women, people from African descent, LGBTI plus people, and Roma and Sinti people and travellers. Now, it's very possible that someone could belong to more than one of these groups and also have another internal feature that renders them particularly vulnerable. For instance, think of a young woman who's aged under 18, who left her home in Sudan, where her family lived in poverty, and who has a health condition. So vulnerability can be really quite a complex position. The first beneficiary that we're going to focus on is Salifu. Salifu and his sisters were raised in Guinea, West Africa by their mother. Their father died when Salifu was 2 years old, and their uncle then looked after the family. Their home had no electricity or running water. The family's main income came from working in rice fields. Salifu didn't have access to education as a child, but when he reached the age of 14, he moved alone to Gambia to study the Quran, as his father had done, with the intention of becoming a teacher. A year later, his uncle died, and Salifu had to return to Guinea to try to provide for his family. Because of economic hardship there, he decided to move to Senegal to try to find better work opportunities. Salifu, however, found few work options in Senegal, and at the age of 16, he decided to make the journey to Europe. After travelling for more than a week, Salifu was on a boat that capsized in the Atlantic Ocean. He was rescued along with others by the Red Cross off the shore of Tenerife. He received medical attention there because in the boat he'd suffered from exposure to the elements and had many cuts and sores on his body. In Malaga, a kind person offered him help and enabled him to call his family in Guinea to let them know that he had arrived in Europe. Salifu also met others in Malaga who had travelled to Europe and who wanted to apply for asylum in France. Salifu speaks several languages, including French. He joined them as they made their way to Paris by train.
In the eyes of the law, Salifu is an unaccompanied migrant child. The official term is unaccompanied minor, in French mineur non accompagné, which means he's a person under the age of 18 who emigrated to France without a parent or an adult who is authorized to represent him. As France is a signatory to the 1989 Convention of the Rights of the Child and a member of the European Union, Salifu will receive the protections provisioned both within the Convention and the EU Council conclusions on the promotion and protection of the rights of the child. The latter specifically protects children during emigration. In material terms, this means that France has a legal obligation to provide him with access to healthcare, education between the ages of 3 and 16, provide free housing within a foster home or a designated center for minors, and offer child protection policies while they monitor him until he comes of age. The relevant authority that grants these protections in France is the aide sociale à l'enfance of each department, so the responsibility is within each local authority. It is important to mention here that it is not a dedicated service for unaccompanied minors. It is the child welfare service for all children under the care of the French state, including those who live under challenging conditions with their families in their own homes. What is very encouraging is that in 2022, a new child protection law was passed in France that increases the age of majority from 18 to 21 to extend the length of protection that is granted to children. An unaccompanied minor applying for protection with ACE will be asked to describe their journey from their country of origin to France, asked to submit documents proving their identity, like ID or a school certificate, and failure to supply these documents may result to a request for a bone test that will determine their age. The work of the Aide Sociale à l'Enfance is complemented by a number of NGOs, including Utopia 56 and France Terre d'Asile, that offer provisional shelter for minors until their applications are examined, and often continue to support them if their applications are not successful. Once they reach adulthood, unaccompanied minors have 3 options. They can either apply for asylum, which is the process that we will look at today. They can apply for a residence permit, however, this is quite limited, or they can apply for a work permit. However, this would imply that they've been in continuous education, have been able to secure an apprenticeship, have been able to study, or have a position in a training scheme. In Salifu's case, his best course of action will be to apply for protection as an unaccompanied minor and apply for asylum at the same time with OFPRA. The processes are not conflicting. Salifu would apply for asylum in the same manner as an adult with 2 additional protections. One is the local authority would designate to him an adult who would be accompanying him and representing him throughout the process, as he's a minor, so he cannot represent himself. And the other is, while for asylum seekers, there is the Dublin procedure, where if France is not their first country of call when arriving in Europe, they might be asked to return to the first country where they entered the EU so that that country examines their application. This doesn't apply for children as they are too vulnerable to be relocated. So what would it mean if Salifu applied for asylum in France? The administrative process is lengthy and lasts between 6 and 9 months. Recognition is often less dependent on the circumstances of the applicant and more dependent on the documentation that they are able to produce to prove their circumstances. We have come across beneficiaries at Serve the City who had very, very similar circumstances. One beneficiary was recognized within 3 weeks. The other beneficiary was recognized after 3.5 years. Thinking of a young boy at 16 who left West Africa traveling in a boat that capsized, how likely would it be that Salifu has his passport or his school leaving certificate in hand? On the other hand, thinking about the organization that grants asylum, OFPRA, and the fact that in 2024 they had 150,000 applications, how is it possible for them to examine each dossier and make a decision without having key information like proof of identity and country of origin? So if Salifu applied for asylum, on day 0, he would register with a dedicated asylum application service center, which is the Guichet Unique des Demandes d'Asile, which is commonly known in France as GUDA. In Ile-de-France, in the region where Paris is located, due to the high volume of applications, there is a pre-registration step, even before day 0, where Salifu would have to get in touch with OFI, which is the French Office for Immigration and Integration, and then he would be directed to an initial reception establishment for asylum seekers, which is called ESPADA, Structure de Premier Accueil des Demandeurs d'Asile, who would pre-register his details and prepare a form for him to go to his appointment with GUDA. There, an additional step is that his fingerprints might be taken, and this is for the Dublin process, as we previously mentioned. For any asylum seeker to be evaluated, France first needs to establish whether France should be the country examining their dossier. However, in Salifu's instance, as he's an unaccompanied minor, he wouldn't be asked to return to the first country where he entered the EU. Instead, he could ask to join another family member that is already in the EU or applying for asylum in the EU. Once he submits this information to GUDA, he will receive an appointment with a local authority and OFI who will verify this information, and this will trigger 2 processes. The first process is the protection from the French state, and specifically from the Office Français de Protection des Réfugiés et Apatrides, OFPRA. They will give him an attestation de demande d'asile, which is a piece of paper that is legal proof that he can stay in France for 6 months until OFPRA examines his dossier. He will have access to accommodation, which is limited and given to the most vulnerable first. And also, he may be eligible for a monthly allowance. For children, that's 90 euros, and for adults, that's 227 euros. This support is subject to him accepting the accommodation provided by OFI, which may often be outside Paris or even in a different city until his application is examined. He will also have access to education and be enrolled in school. What is interesting about the asylum-seeking application process is that applicants are not eligible to work for 6 months. So an able-bodied adult who wants to work while OFPRA is examining their application is not allowed for 6 months and may only seek a job after 6 months if OFPRA has not come back to them with a response, and if the delay is the fault of the organization rather than the applicant not having submitted the relevant documentation. This was quite stunning for me, as the stipend of 227 euros is quite low and gave me a deeper understanding of where all this complementary work from all the associations comes into play in this process. So that's the first process triggered by registration with GUDA. The second is that the dossier will move from GUDA to OFPRA. An appointment will be booked, and then OFPRA will examine the application. That can have 3 outcomes. An applicant can be recognized as a refugee, they can receive subsidiary protection, or they can be denied. In case of a denial, the applicant will have 1 month to lodge an appeal with the National Court of Asylum, the Cour Nationale du Droit d'Asile, known as CENDIA. A negative CENDIA ruling will end the asylum-seeking process and will result in an obligation to leave French territory. There is a process to be followed with an obligation to leave France, but a number of people who have been refused by CENDIA tend to try and stay here. The difficulty with that being, in the eyes of the law, they become illegal immigrants, so it's very difficult to find a house, to find a job. So life becomes very complicated for them. So, in Salifu's case, can you tell us how he navigated this process in France?
Well, turning to Salifu, in Paris he applied for recognition as an unaccompanied minor. But his original application wasn't successful. He wasn't granted accommodation, so he spent the first 2 months of 2024 sleeping on the banks of the Seine. He was then put in contact with NGOs that could offer support. With their help, Salifu was able to appeal the original decision about his application. In the summer of 2024, he received recognition as an unaccompanied minor in France. That formal recognition by the state means that Salifu receives legal protection, a place to live, and access to a French public school. He's also found a safe space in a football program, and he's now working towards an apprenticeship so that he can find work in France and send money back home to his family. Salifu's friends describe him as a compassionate, courageous, and resilient young man with leadership skills.
It's lovely to hear that despite the difficulties, he managed to come through the other end of the process and be recognized. So, may you introduce our second beneficiary story for this training?
Our second profile focuses on Kimia. Kimia is a widow in her late 20s who arrived in Paris with her 6-year-old daughter after fleeing violence in her home country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. Since the beginning of the conflict there between different Congolese military and militia groups in 1996, it's estimated that more than 6 million people have been killed. More than 1 million people from the DRC have fled the country and sought refuge elsewhere. Kimia's husband was killed during the conflict. This led her to decide to leave and make her way to Europe with her daughter to seek a better, safer life for both of them. They travelled by plane to Tunisia, then took a boat to Italy, and from there they came to France by bus. In her village in the DRC, Kimia was a weaver and repaired clothes with her mother as a way of earning a living. She is still close to her mother and her 2 sisters, and she hopes to call them from France whenever she can. Kimia doesn't speak French. She knew this would make life difficult for her in France. She needs an intermediary to communicate with relevant authorities. Kimia was unsure how to apply for refugee status. She was put in contact with relevant NGOs that helped her prepare and submit her application. Her major fear was that if she made contact with a governmental authority, her daughter might be taken away from her. So she is distrustful of governmental bodies and authorities. Kimia was officially recognized as a refugee, but there was no housing available for her and her daughter, so she was asked to go to a homeless shelter. Accommodation there is short-term, and the homeless shelter didn't always feel like a safe place for her young daughter. Kimia and her daughter have now been placed in social housing, but she still has a fear that her child will be taken away from her. Kimia hasn't yet been able to find a job or send her child to school. She still relies on NGOs to communicate with the authorities, as well as for sustenance and support.
So, France has signed and ratified the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, and the 1967 protocols, and in addition recognizes refugees under Article 4 of the preamble of the 1946 French Constitution, France also adopts the provisions of the mandates of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. This means that Kimia and her daughter are recognized and protected as refugees in France. The legal definition of a refugee is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for either reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or having a political opinion. Fleeing war is one of the clearest well-founded fears of being persecuted. The protection for refugees is based on 3 principles. The principle of non-discrimination, which means that anyone fulfilling those criteria cannot be denied the status of refugee. The principle of non-penalization, which means that being a refugee can never be a crime and no one can be persecuted for being recognized as a refugee. And the principle of non-refoulement, which means that a refugee cannot be forced to return to their home country. The international law grants refugees 4 rights, and that's access to the courts and the legal system, access to primary education, the right to work, and the provision of a travel document, which means their host country will give them a passport that will be valid for traveling to most countries around the world, with the exception of the refugee's country of origin. In the case of families, so in this case Kenya and her young child, they are recognized as refugees at the same time as the law views them as one family unit. There can be instances where children receive subsidiary protection even if the parent is not recognized as a refugee due to their status as a minor. However, in this instance, Kimia's daughter will be automatically recognized with Kimia at the same time. In France, the term asylum seeker indicates someone who has submitted an application for protection with OFPRA but has not yet received a response. As we previously saw in the application process, the outcome may either be being recognized as a refugee, receiving subsidiary protection, or being refused. Refugees, provided they respect French law, enjoy the following rights: a 10-year residency permit in France, which is the titre de séjour, a travel document, access to social security in the same manner as any French citizen, the right to work, the right to be reunited with their family, and the right to apply for naturalization after 5 consecutive years of residence. In contrast, subsidiary protection, which would be granted if someone was not a refugee, but they were in danger of facing the death penalty, execution, torture, or inhumane or degrading treatment, or face serious threats to their lives. In those instances, subsidiary protection would give them a 4-year residence permit, the right to work, some of the welfare benefits, and the right to family reunification after 1 year of residence in France. To put this into perspective, in 2024, 157,947 people applied for asylum in France. Even with an average examination time of 6 to 9 months, this is a huge administrative task for the French state, which is why, even though the work is complemented by numerous NGOs, including the French Red Cross, Amnesty International, Utopia 56, France Terre d'Asile, and GISTI, this work is still challenging. If we look at the numbers across the EU for asylum applications, we'll see that in 2015, the number of asylum applications was more than 1 million, largely due to the war in Syria. In 2024, 912,000 people applied for asylum in the EU, and 36,290 unaccompanied minors. The migration crisis is an irrefutably significant phenomenon. However, is it threatening or destabilizing for the host countries? When considering the number of asylum seekers per 1,000 EU citizens for 2024, the highest ratio was in Cyprus, with 7.2 asylum seekers per 1,000 Cypriot residents. In the case of France, the number is 1.9 asylum seekers per 1,000 French residents. The main countries of origin for asylum seekers in France in 2024 have been Ukraine, Afghanistan, Haiti, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Guinea, and the Ivory Coast. In aggregate, France today is hosting 689,273 refugees, according to the UNHCR, with the country's population currently standing at 68 million. In turn, Germany has a population of 83 million, and Germany is hosting 2.6 million refugees. So far, we've considered people who've emigrated to France from outside the EU. However, I understand that our third story concerns someone who came to France from within the EU.
Our third profile concerns Mihai, who's 26 years old. He grew up in a rural part of Romania in a family that struggled financially. Mihai had difficulty finding and holding down jobs at home, so he came to Paris 3 years ago with two of his cousins. His cousins had been put in contact with an agent whom they were told would find them work and accommodation. This man and his associates got them work on building sites as casual labourers, although not officially registered. Mihai and his cousins lived in an apartment with 5 other men, most of them from Romania. He quickly acquired enough French to get by in everyday life and was able to send money home to his family. One of Mihai's cousins returned to Romania 2 years ago, and the other moved to Italy last year. Shortly afterwards, he got into a serious dispute with the other men he was working with. It became harder for Mihai to find casual work, and eventually he lost his accommodation too, partly because he could no longer pay for it, and partly because of his confrontational behaviour. He spent some months staying with various pals, but had to move on regularly. Eventually, he ran out of options and is now homeless and has few resources. He hasn't told his family about his situation, even though his mother asks why he stopped sending home money. He won't return to the family home in Romania because he feels ashamed. Mihai is now living in an encampment under a railway bridge between the 10th and 19th arrondissement of Paris. There are a few other East European men there. He gets food and clothing from various associations that visit the encampment, but he feels very lonely, at risk, and without hope. So, Chara, what benefits, if any, would Mihai be entitled to in France as a personne sans abri, a homeless person?
Well, with regards to Mihai's status as a person experiencing homelessness, the definition of homelessness is not universally codified, and there is no designated international law instrument governing such a protection. There are protections within international law, for example, the human dignity principle within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to an adequate standard of living within the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and also a provision in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights stating that all economic, social, and cultural rights are exercised without discrimination of any kind as to national or social origin, property, birth, or other status that includes housing. To explain this, how may a person who is experiencing homelessness access healthcare or maintain a profession without a permanent address? How may they look after their material needs, their mental health needs without secure housing? The French government does adopt a very broad definition of what a homeless person is. They are not only the people who are rough sleeping, but rather anyone who doesn't have a permanent or fixed domicile. It can be someone who's living in the street. It can be someone who's living in an open place like a park, or someone who is living in their car. It may furthermore be a person living in emergency accommodation like a shelter, a camp, or other temporary lodging. A person who is internally displaced, a refugee, or an immigrant. However, the protection granted within French law is simply for anyone who is in a situation of medical, psychological, or social distress, and there it's the provision of emergency accommodation. Emergency accommodation in France is scarce on account of the French state currently estimating 350,000 people without a permanent or fixed address. So while in theory, Mihai could call 115 and get access to emergency housing, it's likely that he will be waiting for a very long time, that the housing might be temporary, and he might find himself again in the same situation after a few days. Now, Mihai is a European citizen, which means he may have access to social security benefits. These do differ depending on whether someone is coming from an EU country or a European country not found within the EU. If he's previously worked in Romania and was contributing to the Romanian social security system, it's likely that he can apply for some of those benefits to be transferred over for him here in France. But really, the best port of call for him would be What Is That?, which is a comprehensive guide, often more than 50 pages, that contains all the associations providing services such as food, shower, laundry, daycare centers, as well as legal aid, and it is available in 5 languages. In this way, he can see which of his needs can be met by associations, but also access legal aid for someone to guide him exactly as to what steps he may take forward.
So you have now encountered the 3 profiles that we'll use in the next in-person session of our training. To prepare for that, we invite you to select one of the profiles, one story that particularly drew your attention and that engaged you. First of all, consider what it is about that particular profile that spoke to you, that engaged you. Then reflect on the questions that we see on the slide. First of all, is there anything that you find surprising about this person's story? Secondly, what might this person's main needs be now? Their material needs, social needs, psychological needs. Thirdly, what challenges might they face in meeting those needs? And finally, what, if anything, might they miss about their lives in their countries of origin? Make notes about your responses to those questions.
Thank you for watching. We hope that you now have a deeper understanding of beneficiaries' journeys. You're more familiar with the beneficiaries' rights and protections, and you now have a more solid basis from which to consider beneficiary needs while reflecting on your own needs, that is to say, your motivations and your limitations in the framework of your volunteering work. Please consult the ServeNow app to register for the upcoming in-person sessions 2 and 3 of this training, which will be led by 3 mental health professionals, Aidan, Patrick, and Jamie, to get the chance to have the tools to strengthen your own mental well-being, create safe spaces for beneficiaries, and reflect on your volunteering journey. Thank you, and see you again soon.